Good afternoon and welcome. We're so glad that you joined us here today. It's great again to be back to some semblance of normalcy and to concert season again with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. We want to thank our friends at the Laramie County Library who host us every time and make this possible, and thank you for your efforts to get it transmitted over the waves to those who might be tuning in from home. My name is William Intriligator, music director and conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by two wonderful guest artists who are new friends. The husband and wife team of Lorraine, pianist, and violinist Terence. We're right back there. Please welcome them.
What that is.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. Hopefully that won't happen again with the feedback. But we're so pleased to welcome them into, I think, what might be their first time in Wyoming. I'm not sure. So exciting. We'll hear from them shortly. This program is a usual one in some respects because we do have two guest artists, two full concertos. And it's a special situation, obviously, because they're husband and wife. They came as a twofer, and we're just delighted to feature them both. And one in a G minor concerto and one in a G major concerto. So how about that? This program entitled, A Time to Discover, actually has more than just the discovery of these two wonderful guest artists, and us getting to know them in their Cheyenne debuts, but also the discovery of perhaps lesser known pieces. Certainly the Baroque Violin Concerto No. 1 and the Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 4 will be well known to many of our audiences, but perhaps this will be your first time hearing Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel's Overture in C that begins the program, and Shuo by Chen Yi, Chinese-American composer, which is the first piece on the second half of the program. So we'll talk about those two pieces first, and then we'll bring up our guest artists to talk about their backgrounds and the two concertos that they're performing. So Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel was the older sister of Felix Mendelssohn, the celebrated composer. About 4 years her brother's senior. She was the first of 4 children, and they grew up in a very, very privileged kind of household. Their father was a very successful banker in Berlin. They were born in Hamburg, but mainly raised, I think, in Berlin. And they had an incredible education as children, which included, on the weekends, having their own orchestra at their disposal that their parents put the bill for, so that they could experiment and write pieces and develop as composers. In their childhood years, both Felix and Fanny were considered equally talented. And it's kind of just a reflection of the roles of women at that time, that Fanny's name is not as known as Felix's, and nor is her music. In fact, at that time, a few of her pieces that she composed were published under Felix's name. He wanted to get her music out. Near the end of her life, she actually did finally publish her Opus 1 collection. Most of her music is actually piano pieces, art songs, and some cantatas for voice and orchestra. Well, the thing about Fanny Mendelssohn's music is that she expected it to be performed in people's homes. She didn't expect it to be performed in big public concert halls. Because again, at that time, women weren't really, in a way, kind of expected to be composers and to have their music on the big stages. Her husband, who was a celebrated artist, was very encouraging of her composing. And so she continued to compose after she was married and had their child. And what's also interesting and fascinating to me is that Felix Mendelssohn continued to seek his older sister's musical advice on his compositions, even after his childhood, even into adulthood. He would write letters to her, and they were very, very close musically as well as personally. And in this case, it's an interesting kind of relationship. You would think that Felix Mendelssohn, the great celebrated composer, may have taught something to his sister, Fanny, but it's actually the other way. Fanny was the senior. She was 4 years older, and she gave him incredible advice. he nicknamed her Minerva because the goddess of wisdom, because of her incredible musical advice toward him. So the piece that we're going to start the program with is her only known purely orchestral piece. As I said, she wrote a lot, like hundreds and hundreds of piano pieces, art songs, cantatas, that some of which involve an orchestra. But this piece, this overture in C major, is her only purely orchestral piece. And as a piece of sort of absolute music without a program or a story, and it's not an overture to an opera or play, incidental music or anything like that, it can be seen as sort of almost like an individual first movement of a symphony, if you will. It has that same kind of structure of a slow introduction and then a presentation of themes in the well-established form of a symphony at that time for the 1830s, the sonata allegro form. So what's also interesting to me is that this piece was written when she was between 25 or 26 years old. So she, pretty young still. But of course, we know that Felix had some masterpieces when he was 16, 17 years old, like the octet for strings and the Midsummer Night's Dream overture. So both these brother and sister were incredibly precocious. We know about this piece simply because there was a letter that Fanny wrote to her brother Felix saying that I conducted my overture the other day at home. It was one of these home concerts. So even after their childhood home concerts, even in adulthood, the concert at home. And she said it had been 2 years since she wrote it. So that's the only reason we know that it actually came from 1830. And many sources mistakenly think it was from 1832. But this letter in June of 1832 says, I finally conducted it. And it went just as I had hoped. And it had been about 2 years since I wrote it. And so it's great to see this in a letter. And so, but nobody knew where the music was. It's also interesting to me that she was the conductor of the premiere, because again, it wouldn't have been, maybe accepted for a woman to be a conductor in 1830 or 1832 when this was first performed. But the music, the sheet music, lay dormant for 152 years until it was discovered in a Mendelssohn archive among a lot of different letters and music, and put together and finally published and performed for the second time in the 1990s. Incredible, really. And it's like a voice from the past, and it's such a teaser of an incredible musical talent and a musical voice that we wish we had more music from. And one of the things that fascinates me are the ways that it does sound similar to her brother's music. And I'm not saying that she was influenced by him or he was influenced by her, but they had the advantage of nature and nurture, the same DNA and upbringing. So somehow they had, I think, some similar musical personalities in their music. Here's a little sample of the beginning of that overture, the way that our concert will start. With just French horns and then a beautiful theme, like not a theme, but a sigh in the strings, answered by the woodwinds. There's a sense of mystery and drama and an almost masterful use of silence, right? It goes on, as I said, this is the slow introduction to what will become a much faster main section of the overture. And actually, the main theme of the overture, when it does come in the allegro section, it sounds very much like an early piece of her brother's, Felix Mendelssohn's Nocturne. Let me just fast forward to that. For the 1830s, it's that early romantic time, you know. I don't know. Sorry, I apologize. I don't know what that was. But there's a feature of the woodwinds quite a bit. The woodwinds have beautiful singing voices, and she utilizes each individual woodwind as almost a different character. So sometimes you'll hear a clarinet in a yearning way, and then an oboe in a different kind of way, and a flute. She also utilizes the brass in a special way. There's a part where there's a sudden brass fanfare that comes out of the blue, almost reminiscent of a part from the Midsummer Night's Dream overture of the Brothers. And then the writing for the strings is just gorgeous. The second theme, to me, this is the part that makes it sound like this is really a Mendelssohn. Is it sounds again like her music of her brothers, and I don't mean that to sound like it's derivative. It's not. It's purely her own music, but it's just so gorgeous, and it has a style that sounds like Felix's music as well. Sorry, I gotta find it here. Here it is. This part here also has a very Felix-y kind of sound, Felix Mendelssohn. There's a sort of grace about it and nobility almost to the type of musical expression that's, yes, it's romanticism, but it's almost that type of early romanticism that you would expect in Felix Mendelssohn's, Shakespeare-inspired Midsummer Night's Dream. That type of feeling. It's not Sturm und Drang, it's not hard on sleeve, it's just in that little niche of German early romanticism where it has an almost kind of noble quality. I'm just going to say that again. It's a teaser, like I said. I wish there were more music for orchestra like Fanny, Mendelssohn, Hetzel, but maybe this will also help us all discover more of her music, her piano music or her songs. There's a great story I want to share about how one of the songs that she wrote, a song called Italian, sort of Italian inspired, was published by Felix to get her music out there under his name, even though she wrote it. Felix, of course, toured around many of the countries in Europe, and including in the United Kingdom, and he knew Queen Victoria and Prince Albert fairly well after 4 visits, I think, that he had with them. One time he came to Buckingham Palace, which is now their new residence, as you know from history. And Queen Victoria herself wanted to perform a song of his, which was her favorite song. And so she started performing Italian. And so Felix was like, oh, that was actually written by my sister. Thank you, what a compliment. I don't know if he was embarrassed or if he was delighted to announce that, and get more recognition for his sister. But that was an interesting story. But yeah, it was just, at that time, even their parent, their father is quoted as saying, for Felix, music can perhaps be a profession. I like how he says perhaps. But for Fanny, it will only be an ornament. She has to marry, children, and this is just the role of women. That was indicative of the way it was at that time. But what an incredible musical voice that she has. And hopefully you'll hear that in the overture tomorrow. After the intermission, we're going to play music that I'm sure will probably be new to you by Chinese-American composer Chen Yi. She's on the faculty at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. She's been there, I think, since the 90s. She grew up in China, playing violin and piano, and then was sent into forced labor camps, actually farming, and told not to have anything to do with these Western instruments for a time during her teens and early 20s. When the Central Conservatory opened in Beijing, she was the first woman admitted and the first one to graduate. She studied at Columbia University in New York and went on to many other distinguished. She actually taught at the Peabody Institute, where our 2 wonderful guest artists both studied. And so she's a quite celebrated composer. And I think our playing of her music is now a little bit overdue. And so I'm excited to perform this piece for strings called Schwung. It started out as part of her string quartet. In the 1980s, she wrote a string quartet. In the 1990s, she orchestrated for string orchestra, adding the bass and special, sections for the full strings or solo strings. And it's a piece that, well, the title comes from the word sort of to initiate, and it's also the word for the first day of each day of the lunar months. I think what's interesting is that there are some Chinese folk themes that are first presented in the viola, and then there's a sort of a Western kind of theme that's presented in the full strings. And then again, we get back to a Chinese, this time like a mountain singing song, she describes it, and it's presented in the full strings. It's slow and beautiful. And then again, there's this Western sounding motif from before. And so we almost have like a rondo kind of A, B, A, C, a kind of form where she goes back and forth between Eastern and Western styles of music. Just give it a little listen here. I'll play this sample. Let's see. In the opening, the first kind of main singing part is for a solo viola, or actually technically sola viola. To this other theme, the sort of more Western style. But still, it has hints of Asian tonalities. There's a use of a pentatonic kind of scale, like it's playing just the black keys on the piano. There's a quality about the music that, by using that it has a sort of Asian feel to it. It's so singing and beautiful, and the voices in the strings, they're just overlapping in these beautiful ways. So again, this is that sort of overture, but then again, the upbeat kind of more Western music is presented, and then presented in fugue and in canon, and using all these sort of more traditional classical composer techniques. So there's a wonderful fusion of different styles. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and there's a very exciting part where the music really takes off. Sorry, one second. It's right around here. Version of some of these initial themes, really stretched broadly, and now suddenly a solo violin. Extended solo for our concertmaster Stacy. Then it kicks up again and it has an incredibly rousing ending too. It's a really beautiful piece as a whole, and I think it's a great way to discover this composer's music if you're unfamiliar with their music already. And again, of course, all season long we're celebrating women composers, as we did on our concert last month with all women composers, and now with Fanny and with Sid Pencil and Jenny. And so now I want to turn it over to our guest. Well, not turn it over. I want to invite our guest artist to come up and join me. And we'll get to know them, and we'll get to know the two concertos that they're performing. Please give a warm welcome to Lorraine and Terry Pan. All right, so we've got a microphone for you to share, and I'm not sure where it went. There it is. So tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and where you're from, and I think we had said that this is your first time in Wyoming, right?
Yes, it is my first time in Wyoming. I was born in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and grew up on the West Coast, Pacific Northwest. But I left home quite early for schooling in the United States. So I went to high school at Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a boarding art school in Michigan. And there, my eyes were opened to the great world of arts and music and theater and creative writing and everything. And so after that, I pursued more training at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, Maryland. And of course, had to go to New York City and study at the Juilliard School, where I completed a master's and doctoral degree there. And the memories I have of the incredible teachers and musicians that I met, worked with day after day, I still remember it like yesterday. So here I am now, living in Victoria with Terry, and very excited to be here to perform Beethoven's Fourth Concerto with Maestro Intriligator.
Thank you, Lorraine. So with all the different places that you studied, what was it that drew you back to Victoria? Was it you still had family there, or was it because Terry was there already? Or well, I'm just curious. You know, you could have been based in New York, you could have been based someplace else. But...
That's a great question. So I mostly always knew that home was where I'm from. And my parents lived in Vancouver, and it was exactly that. That was the main impetus for my wanting to move back out west. In fact, when Terry and I were dating, I was quite concerned as the relationship grew more serious because he's from Toronto, Ontario. And I thought, my God, this can't work. I have to live out east. So anyways, he agreed, yes, we'll consider the Pacific Northwest, maybe, but we'll see, because he was born in Toronto. And so then we did get married. We did start a family, first in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a lot colder than Toronto. And then we moved to Australia, where our second child was born. And after that beautiful, amazing weather, where wintertime is like, late spring everywhere else, the thought of moving back to Toronto after Australia was impossible. So we moved to, luckily, to Victoria, which is where I was born, but not where I grew up. I left Victoria when I was about 5 years old. But our kids grew up there, and they actually went to the same elementary school that I went to for 1.5 years. So that's very sweet. Yeah. So that's our story in a nutshell. But I'll let Terry. I'm sure he has other thoughts to add.
Your journey of music and life.
I have a little less colorful path, but I mean, similarly, I was, as you know, I was born in Toronto, and it's amazing how people from the Pacific Northwest area are so afraid of snow. And if you ever see them driving, it's even worse, right? But it's funny, you're just used to, of course, the weather where you're born, and you don't think about it. Anyways, we don't have to keep on talking about weather. And I grew up in Toronto, and I studied, did a lot of my studies in Toronto. All my music, much of my musical training was in Toronto. There's a lot of great teachers there as well. Some great Peabody in Baltimore, the Peabody Institute in Baltimore, also for a year, but actually our paths did not cross there, interestingly enough. So we had not met by that time. And I also did a bit of, I did a year and a half of studying in Europe as well, in Berlin and Paris. So I got a taste, lucky enough to have a taste of music education in the US as well as in Europe. And I'm very thankful for that. So yeah, we moved, just to fast forward, looking back to, yeah, we kind of did a lot of moving. We used to go to Canada and Australia for a few years, then finally back to where we settled and are very happy on the West Coast.
And then you have a position there, which, tell us about.
Yeah, so I'm the concert master of the Victoria Symphony, which is what part of what brought us to Victoria in particular, when there was an opening. And Victoria Symphony is it's a pretty important part of the culture in Victoria. Victoria proper is about, I think, the same population as Cheyenne is. It's about 70,000. But the greater Victoria area is maybe about 300,000 people. And so our symphony is pretty active. We have a 36-week season. And so, you know, there's a concert every week. There's a couple of concerts every week for 36 weeks, and then we have a 2-week summer season. And you know, one of the really iconic things we do in Victoria, we do a summer concert that's been going on for about, I think, 25 years. We celebrated 25th anniversary. It's called Splash, and Victoria is right on the ocean. And there's a beautiful inner harbor, which is famous for, with, you know, lots of historic buildings. And the symphony plays on a barge in the ocean. Yeah. And that faces the grounds of our Victoria, the capital of British Columbia province. And so the Parliament buildings are right there, and basically tens of thousands of people come out to this outdoor concert, which is amplified, and they all sit on the lawns, and it's kind of what you think of as, you know, a great kind of summer concert, and it brings all sorts of people who don't normally come to classical music concerts. It brings all sorts of people out who have never gone to the symphony. And our hope always is, besides creating great events, that we get some of those people curious enough to come into the concert hall during the regular season and listen to some great music.
Wonderful. You know, you both have achieved quite a lot of success in music, but I also think it's interesting that Lorraine has been single-minded her, you know, pursuit on piano, and from her teen years on, whereas Terry, you have had a lot of other interests. Tell us about that. Well, I mean, like the piano is sure.
Yeah, I mean, I not to take away from, I mean, there's pros and cons, obviously. Single-mindedness is pretty good too. It's hard to be successful, I think, without a certain, successful in whatever your discipline is, without putting in those numbers of hours. But yeah, I was a pianist up until kind of early college years, and I was just as, in some ways, just as serious in piano as I was in violin. I was performing concertos on piano too, and I kind of really didn't make my decision to be a violinist until college age, basically. So I also was very interested in academics as well. And so my first degree was actually a bachelor's of science in biology, and not in music. I had a minor in music at the time. I still, as we were telling the high school kids this morning, I practiced like a fiend. I practiced the violin, you know, 3 to 4 hours a day, even when I was doing my science degree, and that was difficult. But I was quite determined to keep up the music because I knew music was going to be a very large part of my life.
And So, do you want to talk a little bit about the concertos that you're performing?
I'll start because Beethoven did before. Well, as you know, Beethoven was one of the greatest composers that ever lived, and for good reason. He holds that high regard from all of us who've heard of him. He wrote 5 piano concertos, all of which are distinct masterpieces in our great, piano literature, and equally beautiful, each of them, different to each. And I would say that this fourth concerto is the one that stands apart, even more so than the other 4. And I will explain a few things about what I love about the piece, but ultimately, when you hear it, I think you'll understand what I mean. William, I was very inspired by your speech about Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, besides all of the great things that you mentioned he was a great champion of other composers. And some of you may already know the story of how he revived Bach's music, which is huge because Bach is altogether another great composer. We could go on all day about Bach. But for this concerto, the fourth concerto by Beethoven, it was actually lost for almost 30 years. It was not. And Beethoven himself premiered this concerto, I think around 1807. He performed it at a house concert, but the official kind of premiere was at a theater in Vienna in 1808. And perhaps what did not help his this concerto was the fact that he programmed 2 symphonies. I think it was the 5th and the 6th, along with the choral fantasy, and it was a very long concert. And I'm sure, especially for the audience. So things were not working for him. Needless to say, this concerto kind of got lost in shuffle, and it was around almost 30 years later, in something like 1836, where Mendelssohn rediscovered this concerto. So it was really great to hear you talk about Mendelssohn, to program a Mendelssohn, because Mendelssohn had a large part of why today the Beethoven Fourth Concerto is revered as one of the most special out of his concerto. I never quite got to telling you why it's so special. So I will, before I hand the mic over to Terry, and of course I'll play a few little excerpts from it to give you a better idea. Beethoven, as we think of him, is the man with the crazy hair and the bad temper. I mean, who wouldn't have a bad temper when you can't hear, right? But this piece evokes something so unusual to what we think of Beethoven as. Now, this is not to say that Beethoven is an angry composer, because, he has a messy demeanor. He was very effusive in his expression, and he never really kept a secret to the feelings of the music. But this concerto is much more introspective, and that the beauty, which you'll hear immediately, first chord of the whole concerto, is one that doesn't need to emote in that way. The beauty in it lies in the fact that it's just, I don't want to say quiet, because it is quiet in its manner, but it also has shimmers and colors and intense emotions, but they're just not what we expect. And I can't really put it into the right set of words. And I suppose that's what makes what we do as musicians so incredible, that there are certain things that are expressed in music that there are no words for.
I mean, this piece is fascinating, the fact that it is daring and innovative, but yet introspective and at times even dreamy. Again, it also has all these other elements. There's the second movement, which is a whole unusual thing unto itself, unlike any other concerto, even any other Beethoven concerto. So the slow movement of this concerto, do you want to talk about that a little bit, or do you want to just play a little bit of the first movement?
Sure.
For us, or-
It's very true. There's just so much to talk about here. I don't want to mislead you into thinking that you're not going to get the Beethoven that we all know. Because believe me, there is drama, there's usual use of intensity and silence, or intensity, which Beethoven was a master at. And of course, there are elements that you hear in his Emperor Concerto, number 5, with the sustained pedal and
The pedaling is fascinating. The
It
whole
is.
story of the concertos, where he starts writing pedal markings in the first movement, is very indicative of where he was thinking at that time and the development of the piano itself as an instrument. And then there's even a chord up pedal indication for the slow movement, which in Beethoven's time, the sort of muting pedal, which is not the sustained pedal, but the one that's on the far left pedal, that unicorda pedal, in Beethoven's day, that had a completely different sound for the instrument. And when that right up during the trill, it totally like changes the sound. I almost feel like he created this dramatic slow movement to take advantage of the new color of the unicorda pedal. I don't know that for a fact, but I have heard it, this piece, that movement played on one of the Beethoven pianos from the Beethoven House in Bonn. And the unicorda pedal completely changes the color. It's not a muting, it's a total color change. Sorry, I'm just
Yeah,
passionate about
no,
this
it's-
pedaling thing. About
Well,
Beethoven.
it's remarkable. There's so much we can talk about. I have to thank William for wanting to program this concerto so much. I won't lie, when we were originally in touch over 2 years ago, we were saying, by email, before the pandemic, we weren't meaning to be in touch for that long.
Yeah, right. No, we were ready to not meet yet.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I was saying, well, why don't we do number 3, and he said, you write back, yeah, that's a good one, maybe, and I go, oh, there's number 1, and, I named so many other, I firmly always base on number 4.
Well, it's our favorites.
And so when finally he said, this is my favorite, of course, I was and it's definitely one of my favorites too. So thank you for choosing it. Now, so I will just go to the piano, and I don't want to give away too much. So I will just play a few little snippets here and there for you to entice you, to point out some of the things that are special to me.
Yeah. At the time, when Beethoven wrote this, the expected, I guess, standards of the day, the kind of what you would expect would be that there would be a couple minute long introduction by the orchestra, almost like a curtain raiser, if you will, before the soloist comes in. So how shocking it would be for the audience to have a piano concerto start like this.
So before I start with the opening of Beethoven number 4, I'll refresh your memory about the opening of Beethoven number 3, because this will be the Beethoven that is very familiar to us all.
Very good.
difficult to play in a very different way. And so there are many moments in the Beethoven form where you will hear me do things that should sound effortless, but I'll tell you between us, they are not. So here is the passage that follows, and I'll just play it for you, to give you an idea of kind of what kinds of things you will hear, especially in the first movement. I'll need to practice that. So on to the second movement. This is only 2 pages long, and it really is quite interesting how the orchestra and I don't really speak to each other at the same time. In fact, it's as though the piano has its own thing to say, and the orchestra chimes in with its own conversation. And for me, very openly, it's almost religious in the fact that the writing is, first of all, it's a chorale, and it's so incredibly expressive, and I'm trying to find the right words to describe it, but I think I should just play it, because I think for each of us, we'll come up with our own feelings. So I'll just play maybe the first iteration of the piano. This time the orchestra starts, and then the piano follows.
It reminds me of like a late Beethoven bagatelle, where there's so much meaning to the notes, and it's real poetry. And sometimes Beethoven actually struggled the most in writing the most simple pieces. Like, wrote often into how much he took great pains in developing the Ode to Joy to get it just right. It didn't just come out as the Ode to Joy. And through numerous revisions of that simple melody to come up with the perfect simple thing. And there's just, like you said, poetry in this. It's incredible meaning. When the orchestra starts that movement, the strings are very angry, and there's something wrong. And like we so beautifully said, it's like there's a dialogue happening where neither side is listening to them. They're just in their own separate worlds. The strings start here in their anger level. The piano starts here in this other kind of mature, dreamy space. But what's interesting is over the course of the movement, they do kind of change roles. So the strings are finally subdued by the end. Or even halfway through, they start to get subdued as if the pianist is convincing them and easing their pain or something. And there's maybe a moment where they're both kind of at that same level, but then the strings stay silent and their music fades out to just pizzicato plucking, one or two, a couple of plucks, 4. And then the piano part just suddenly starts to blossom in this unexpected way. Maybe you can tell us about that or play it. I don't know how you want to play it.
I don't want to give away too much. It gets very, very good toward the end, short 2 pages. So I don't know. Maybe we'll just
We'll leave it on that.
Yeah, we'll leave it like that.
But we end together in the same group, so it's like we're back as one before we start the third movement, which might start so quietly, and after that second movement that ends so quietly, that you may not even realize that the last movement has started.
That's right.
Yeah.
You may have noticed that I said very little about the last movement. I focused mostly on the first and second. I suppose it's because the last movement is, what we kind of expect. But of course, it's Beethoven, so it's always going to be very, very good. But it's this kind of all's well that ends well, right? Where the sun appears, life is.
But some of those magical music is in here too. So that second, that theme that comes in with the. It's just the most singing and like calming. It's almost like a soothing palliative after the second.
Absolutely. Why don't I end with the main melody of the third movement, so that we end with a smile on our faces, as opposed to, just ending with a slow movement. So I will try to play the opening of the third. As I said earlier, I'm so excited to be here, and I cannot wait to perform Beethoven's Fourth with Maestro William Intriligator, and I will pass the mic over now to Terry.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And I feel terrible that we've been waxing poetic about Beethoven so long, we don't have enough time for Brooke, but we can go a little long too, but tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the Brooke. You have a long history with this piece, right?
Yes, I do. I've known this concerto since I was 15. And it is, it's funny because it is, when the piano included, there generally are kind of, when we start learning concertos, in other words, these pieces which are accompanied by orchestra or played with orchestra, we tend to have a certain number that we start with when you start to learn. And it's horrible, but I have no other way to say it but to say beginner concertos. But they're not beginner in any way. It's just they are the ones that you start with when you start learning concertos. And so in a sense, the Bruch concerto is kind of tends to be one of the first concertos that kind of talented inspired young violinists will learn. But there's the great Mendelssohn violin concerto, one of those. And it's not because they're easier in any way, but it's often because I think emotionally they're kind of easier, at least to get into for a young person. And what I mean is that I'm talking mostly romantic. Mendelssohn, Bruch, they are romantic violin concertos. And when you're just starting puberty, well, say too much more. But it's a great fit. You've got adolescent musicians and they're studying this kind of hot-blooded romantic music. And this Bruch concerto is truly kind of much more of a heart on the sleeve type of, just a heart-pounding type of dramatic, lyrical, romantic in the literary sense of, well, not literary, but the definition of romance, really, as opposed to just the period of music. So it's what I love about it is that every time I come back to it, I'm reminded of my teen years. And unfortunately, those are getting quite far away. And we have teenagers now ourselves, and so it's just a nice feeling because it just transports you right back to that time of being a teenager.
Yeah, that's so great. But then when you come back to something like this, you bring your own mature mastery of your instrument and different ideas, obviously, than you had when you were starting out, or not starting out, but 15-year-old learning this concerto to play it back then. How is that now? I mean, do you, like, for me, when that happens, I find that, for one thing, I have to have completely fresh set of music, like this actual sheet music. I don't want to use my old music. Otherwise, all those old ideas, my scribbles and everything, all just comes running back. Is that, do you have anything like that?
For sure, I understand what you're talking about. When you come back to this type of music, then it's kind of, I would think, coming back to anything that you did as a young person, you also, because most of us, what we did when we were younger, it's kind of stuck in here in a certain way that will always, that we remember. Most of us remember those times very, very clearly. I can remember when I was 15 better than I can remember, a year ago, to be honest. All right? I think we all know that. But, the interesting thing is when you come back to a piece that you played when you were 15, as William is implying, you actually come back to all the bad habits that you had then too. And not that it was all bad habits, but there was some really good stuff that you try to get back from those years too, which are hard to get, like just that youthfulness and the abandon and that whole sense of invincibility that we all had as teens, and you had that with the play too. That's what you're trying to get back. You're trying to get rid of the stuff that was bad habits that you did, things that you've grown out of and you've matured. So yeah, you come back to music, and I do sometimes, increasingly so. I have started either I don't use the music at all, or I try to come fresh because it's all marked up with stuff from different teachers, and some of those are maybe not right anymore. And so, but it's always a pleasure to come back because you do see things differently. As a person, you've matured, so you interpret the music differently, and you realize, I mean, this is obvious, but you start to realize, Max Brook was not a teenager when he composed this music. He didn't compose it for teenagers. And, so then you realize, okay, you see it as an adult or as an older adult, and you then kind of interpret it differently. You realize it's not just looking at it from the one side. There are things about it that you interpret from.
It's so true. I mean, the more I study this piece, and I think I first conducted it back in the 90s. I was just starting out as a conductor, and I think it was one of these like youth concerto competitions where some teenage kid won the competition and did the third one. So, but this is my first time coming at it as a more mature conductor and a completely fresh sport. And I'm just amazed at the maturity and the sort of sense of these little details in the piece. You mentioned Brooke wasn't a teenager, and so that's absolutely true. But I'm now impressed when I went back and studied, I was actually surprised that he was only between 25 and 30 when he wrote this, because it does seem like music of a more mature person in some of those respects. So the piece has both of these things in it. It has this heart on sleeve romantic, abandoned kind of thing, but it also has like incredible nuance in the orchestration and the interplay between the violin and the different instruments, rich horn, cellos, the different woodwinds. I mean, it's really a masterpiece.
Yeah, it really is. It's the reason why it's basically his most popular competition, and there are people like that where there's just one iconic piece they wrote, which for whatever reason they couldn't top or audiences, didn't feel were their best. And what he does with what's really striking about this piece through all three movements is just the melodies that he writes, and he gives them to, as Maestro says, to every instrument as well. And very lyrical, and different lines going on at the same time, but just unforgettable melodies and songs, and he's just overflowing with beautiful stuff.
It's so true. I mean, many of you might also know his Scottish Fantasy, another great violin concerto that he wrote. And then his, Col Nidre and other pieces. But this is his most famous piece, and in a way, for good reason. He was upset that this piece overshadowed his other violin concertos and many of his other pieces. But I mean, it's helped him.
Yeah, apparently, I only found this out because now we have Google, of course, and I get to discover new things about was very, at some point, very distraught that people just wanted to hear this one concerto, and they clamor around him and they say, we just want to hear the concerto. And just be like, I hate that thing, please listen to my other works. And this guy is kind of a curse to write such a great piece that everything seems to pale in comparison to it.
Yeah, it's the same bolero syndrome that happened with Ravel. Ravel was so upset that all of his music was, everybody just thinks of it as the composer bolero. Exactly.
But at the same time, with masterpieces like the Bolero or this concerto, then you also it does make you realize when you go back and really look at these pieces, there's a reason why people just kept coming back to them because they truly were in almost all cases they are actually just masterpieces. They're just done so well that the general public is happy to just listen to that great hit because it's good every time.
Now, I imagine as a concertmaster in Victoria and the other situations where you played in orchestras, you had to actually play the accompaniment part, perhaps, for this concerto. How is it for you in both these roles? I mean, you're a soloist quite often, but you're also a concertmaster. Is it like flipping a switch, or is it hard to get into a different frame of mind? The concertmaster role is it has its own set of expectations and leadership, and then the soloist role is almost like completely different.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how do you make that transition?
Sure. Yes, it's a great question. I think there's big differences and there are some similarities too. But yeah, the difference is as a concertmaster, as a violinist in the orchestra, I'm much more in a box. I'm kind of in some ways not in a negative way, but I'm limited in freedom that I have, and I need to work directly with the conductor, and working. My responsibility is to the conductor, to the orchestra as a whole, and one section. And we're trying to basically keep the whole group together and play as one voice, and that's really the goal for all of us in the orchestra. Where things are a little bit different as a little bit more like a soloist as a concertmaster, in particular, that there are concertmaster solos, and some of them are very difficult. And just in the Chinese piece that you're listening to now, that there sound like there's some pretty crazy solos there. and when I have to play those solos as concertmaster, or let's say the principal cellist or the violin have to play those solos, you kind of get thrown into the spotlight all of a sudden as if you were the concerto soloist. And that is a very, that's a skill that has to be learned, where you can flip on that switch and you get out of the orchestral playing mode of trying to blend in with everybody else and create an overall sound, with all of a sudden kind of being in spotlight and making sure that you sound like there is a spotlight as well.
In the middle of the same piece, so very
Yeah.
with the switch.
Yeah.
In this case, that for this whole week you're a soloist.
Yeah.
I mean, you're away from your orchestra, taking a week off or whatever, and so it's so interesting. I like when you describe your role as a concertmaster. It's almost like, well, not the box part, but like I know that concertmasters try to interpret what the conductor and the composer, of course, are interpreting. You're trying to realize their vision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas in a concerto, and the conductor is trying to realize the soloist's vision. So it's like you're the main thing.
Yeah, it's very different. There's much more freedom. Although, again, as I got more experience with playing concertos and more experience being in the orchestra, I think it's really helped me in concerto playing because I'm very used to communicating and following conductors. And so that actually helps in a concerto situation, because there are actually times when it's better for the soloist to follow the conductor and not just the conductor following the soloist. And I think that ends up creating a much better performance if there's a bit of
come in and play in their own little silo, they're listening to the whole orchestra. And as a concertmaster, you're attuned to listening to the whole orchestra all the time. And so you're especially sensitive to all the accompanimental parts. And I'm sure, as you're playing a little duet with the French horn for a measure or two, that's all this stuff that, you're not just in your own little solo world, you're really attuned to that. I'm sorry that we're running out of time. We could keep talking about this and getting into the next part. One of the questions I normally ask the violin soloist is there anything unusual about your instrument, or is it old or special, or is it Italian, is it French, or is the bow new, or is there anything like that you want to share in this last few minutes?
For sure. I can just quickly.
Yeah.
Let me grab it.
If you guys need to leave, that's fine, but we'll keep going for a little bit.
Yeah,
So I can go with you.
So my violin is an Italian violin. Made in Cremona, which is where all the great violins and Stradivarius, or the Guarneri's. Mine, unfortunately, is not a Stradivarius. I have to save some money for the house. But this is a Giuseppe Cerruti, and it is probably, we think it was made in 1810, so it has celebrated its 200th birthday not that long ago. I was lucky enough to have this, my parents purchased this for me in 1984, and so I've had it for a long time.
That's unusual for a violinist to be playing the same instrument this many years, like almost 30 years.
It is, and part of that is like I said, I was just very lucky that my parents could afford this and were willing to spend that kind of money in 1984. And the other part of the reason why I've had it for so long is because I can't afford anything better than this. The prices have skyrocketed. So, I remember going in '84 to this famous shop in Philadelphia to buy this instrument. But as part of the fun of it, I got to try a Stradivarius among other instruments. And that Strad at that time was, I believe, like $150,000 in '84. And of course now they're all a minimum of $1.5 million, right? And up, right? So they go as high as whatever, I don't know, 4 or 5 the record. So that's why, like I said, nobody can afford these instruments. Very, very few, even the world's greatest soloists can actually afford their own Stradivarius, because as you can imagine, people aren't just plunking down $3 million on a violin, right? So that's the state of that's the interesting thing about this. And so yeah, so this is I'm very happy with this violin.
It sounds beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
And also, I have to, sorry, the back of it is absolutely gorgeous.
Back, I don't know if you can see it. It's not that. It's cut on the nut. So it's got all sorts of swirls.
That's unusual.
Yeah.
That's especially gorgeous.
Yeah. So often you just see wood grain, straight lines, and this is kind of a beautiful swirl and a nice color for the wood part. Yeah. I mean, I wish they had allowed me to Strad, but.
I know that we're over time, but would you maybe just play a few things?
Sure. I'll play the opening of the Broker, which interestingly enough has some commonalities with the Beethoven concerto that Lorraine played, not just because we're G minor, G major. I think that's maybe Williams' design, I'm not sure. But it also starts, it has a very, very short orchestra introduction, which is, again, kind of unusual. You usually, we kind of expect to hear 2 to 3 minutes of the orchestra playing as an introduction first, and then the solo comes in. And that's kind of, the other 3 of the Beethoven concertos and Brahms violin concerto, they start with that. But here the orchestra plays a tiny bit, and then the violin comes in by itself with no orchestra. So kind of similar to what Lorraine's concerto is like.
Okay, you see how a Baroque bow in there, so is that right? Like, do you play Baroque bow? Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I do. This is a William, I just said, he's really observant. And he noticed, he's looking in my case and he noticed the Baroque bow here. And you can kind of see the Baroque bow, if you look at the tip of it, it's like, if you look at here, right, that is very different from a modern bow. Of course, I mean, when we say modern, this bow is from the early 90s, it's like 100 years old. So if you look at the tip, you look at the tip here, and so very different. And it's longer too. So okay, hold on. Yeah, so you can see, right? So this is actually it looks like this. It looks like an inch, more than an inch longer as well. And that just again that reflects the type of music that was played. You know, Vivaldi is very different. Vivaldi, and everything before that is very different than Baroque, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, that type of thing. And so the reason I have a Baroque bow is because, well, over the last, half century, there's been a movement towards playing Baroque music in the style, in the true style, and with the instruments that the Baroque period used. So what that means is because the instruments changed, and the Baroque violin is not really quite the same as what I'm using now, and the bow is not quite the same, and that's why the music is very. And when you hear the music, it's different too. So there's a whole movement. There's thousands of musicians out there who are doing period performance, which is where they really try to adhere to how they think they play and perform a style that performed back in 400 years ago, and it's all based on a lot of research. A lot of it's very good. A lot of it is kind of making it up, to be honest, but because we have no recording, no videos in those days, so we're going on historical writings basically. But it's very interesting, and that's what. And then the final answer is because my orchestra in Victoria, we have a kind of a Baroque series, and so we've been trying to we play on as much Baroque gear as we can, and try to play in the style of more Baroque stuff when we play that type of thing.
I know it's a little bit of a diversion, but it might be interesting for folks just to hear about that. One of the things that I want to just add is that you're right how the instrument developed, from the Baroque era to the classical. The fascinating part of that story to me is that it reached its pinnacle then shortly after that. And violins and other string instruments haven't really had technological advances for maybe 300 years. Well, in 250 years, they hit the pinnacle. Like, your mentioning Stradivarius, nobody has beat that. Nobody has perfected the shape, the sound, everything. And in today's day and age where technology changes from month to month, and our phones are obsolete after a year or whatever it is, it's so refreshing that there's this instrument, all violins basically, that reach their pinnacle of perfection, and they're still there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, just not to end with something too controversial, but there are people who think that in a way Western classical music reached some of its pinnacles in there's nothing, you can't top Beethoven in a way, right? If you could say, well, who's better than Beethoven? Who's better than Mozart? There's no obvious answer to that. That music is always going to be there. We keep coming back to it for many different reasons, but it's the best that was written. It was written like 300 years ago. It's pretty crazy, right? Nobody has kind of topped it, at least in that level. I mean, it's totally debatable, but similarly, it kind of parallels this whole thing with the instruments.
so interesting. Yeah. Great. Well, I wish we had more time. Do you have any questions for Terry or Lorraine? I know that we're already over time, and I really appreciate you staying extra. Thank you for that. Any questions? Anna Marie.
As parents of 6 children who all study at least 2 instruments, how do you practice in your home?
Sure, they do. That's a great question. I should ask you how you did it. We have two teenagers, like I mentioned, 14, 16, and one of them, the old one, plays both piano and violin, and the younger one plays piano and trumpet occasionally. And it's there are times these days where all 4 of us are practicing because that's just the way it is. We have two grand pianos in the house, luckily, on different floors. And I practice in the basement. Of course, I have to be in the basement. Her studio is the floor above, there's another grand piano in the basement. So the kids get the grand piano in the basement, of course. Dad gets to go in the basement. She's somehow on the good floor. And occasionally one of us goes up to the top floor because it's just too noisy. It's like sometimes would you say it sounds like a little bit like a conservatory in there because that's how it is in a music school, and you can hear people then all the other students practicing down the hallway, and you're just kind of shut it out.